Inspired by fellow philosopher Anthony Weston, I often ask my ethics students to create a diabolical toolkit of rules that would torpedo public dialogue. The idea here, I explain, is to spell out rules that would maximize the distance between us and them, ensuring that possibilities for cooperatively setting and achieving social goals like peace, security, justice, public health, sustainability, democracy, go forever unnoticed. For example, consider things like prepare your comeback instead of listening, or be angrier and talk louder than others. I divide students into groups and ask each group to develop 5 more rules. They invariably come up with an excellent toolkit for sabotaging debate. For example, stereotype the other side. Be uncharitable. Always present your side at its best and the other at its worst. Ignore context. Be smug. Trust your anger. It would never steer you wrong. Inflate certainty. Assume your interlocutor is clueless. Reject complexity. Be visibly offended by any questioning of your conclusions. Approach any debate as a winner-take-all game. Widen the gulf that separates us. Act as though your values and concerns invariably overrule theirs. Gradually, some of the fun fades as we reflect on our diabolical toolkit. Gradually, it's dawning upon everyone who's doing this is like, oh, shit. What are we Many of my liberal-identified students, I teach in Virginia in the Blue Ridge Mountains, so I got a mix of different political backgrounds. Many of my liberal-identified students interpret the activity as a send-up of conservatives. They're imagined toolkit users, sport Make America Great Again hats, and threaten DEI advocates. Meanwhile, many of my I wrote that actually before the election, so my record at prophecy is very bad, but in this case, I seem to have done all right. Meanwhile, many of my conservative students interpret the activity as damning liberal wokeness, virtue signaling, and cancel culture. Do you ever follow these rules? I ask them. This is a stretch for some of them, but most of us end up recognizing ourselves. Have we learned anything from doing this? I ask. The sense of the class is that we purposefully drew up a malicious playbook for undermining democracy, and it mirrored business as usual. In my own writings on moral philosophy, I've come to call this cluster of toolkit-like habits moral fundamentalism. Today, I'll very briefly explore 5 questions about it. What is it? Is it really such a bad thing? Is it good for motivating public action? Do many theorists legitimize it? And are we stuck with it? So, first of all, what is it? More than a synonym for moral absolutism, that's Mark Johnson made up this word, but he uses it as a synonym for moral absolutism, and so there's a section in the book where I criticize that, and I say that doesn't go very far in illuminating the situation, because actually I know quite a few moral absolutist philosophers who are not moral fundamentalists. That is, in their behavior, you would never think, and it just wouldn't even occur to you, right? They're not in any way, they don't behave, they don't have the habits of moral fundamentalism that I'm trying to criticize. And there are multiple other reasons that it's kind of helpful to differentiate these. And yet moral absolutism, especially in the monistic forms, I think does underlie the sort of my way or the highway attitude of moral fundamentalism. So more than a synonym for moral absolutism, the term moral fundamentalism applies to people who habitually act as if they have access to, 1, the exclusively right way to diagnose moral or political problems, and 2, the single approvable practical solution to any particular problem. In the book, I go through talk about the sort of contemporary idiom of the last 40 years or so of wicked problems. And I'm using that literature and engaging that to kind of pare it down to this definition. And again, focusing on habits, maybe unsurprisingly, right, for people steeped in pragmatism, instead of focusing on a belief or a doctrine or something like that. That's the mistake I think Marx makes, is focusing too much on the doctrine and not on how does it hit the pavement. Yeah. The word fundamentalism automatically calls to mind rigid religious dogmatism, which is helpful for my purposes, which carries the idea that a select few have accessed ideals that should be heeded without public investigation, critique, and reformation. Like its religious counterpart, moral fundamentalism isn't a promising resource for public dialogue, restoration of trust, or reconciliation. It's a resource for reactionary oppression, rage, and fanaticism on all sides. We must find our diverse ways beyond the hell we inflict in the name of righteous certainty. So, is it really such a bad thing? Yes.
Okay, next part.
For a moral fundamentalist, the main moral, social, or political problem is presumed by default to be that others don't get the problem, as though events carry their own meanings. Or the main problem is presumed to be the failure of others to bow to our brilliant solutions. Never mind aspects of the situation that may be obscured by our way of casting the problem or hidden by our principles. We too readily assume that, unlike their concerns, ours are value neutral and free of interest-driven rationalizations and biases. We never doctor facts to predetermine results. Moral fundamentalism is a drag on democracy. This drag is to be expected when people feel backed into a corner or when their social position limits opportunities. I'm not like shaming or something like that, right? I'm just trying to understand what is it, how does it develop, and to be as empathetic about it as possible while being critical. But fundamentalism anywhere blocks communication and inquiry across differences. Whenever people suppose their reading of a problem is exhaustive, they autocratically predefine what's relevant, and they covertly prejudge alternatives. They assume, as a matter of course, that others are stubbornly refusing to accept the interpretation that is staring right out at them. When we disagree about problems, it's one thing to reflectively conclude that others are willfully refusing to face conditions. In the book, I examine Eddie Law Jr.'s work in this respect, right? I think that's a really good example of saying, look, these people really are just willfully refusing, right, to take seriously the pinch of problems that people are feeling. But that's a reflective. He didn't default to that position, right? He's getting there as a line of argument based on reflection. So it's one thing to do that. It's quite another thing to start with the default assumption that we alone are taking the wide view. Despite these habits, not because of them, moral fundamentalists have historically done many good things through their dealings with opposing fundamentalisms. But what else have they done? Yeah, I'm talking about like right now, right? How do we respond? How do you respond, right? Well, do you just do more of the same, or do you try to figure out something different, something that's actually radical? But what else have they done that might in future be minimized by delegitimizing moral fundamentalism? When we take up the one-way mentality, what happens to opportunities for learning our way toward a healthier, more just, and more sustainable future across the dynamic spectrum of values, beliefs, and concerns? Well, is moral fundamentalism good for motivating public action? Well, it certainly motivates it. But is it good for motivating it? I'm going to argue a qualified no. We're used to assuming that a kind of fundamentalism is the irreplaceable steam that powers activism and advocacy, that resistance to injustice is unintelligible without it, and that the virtues of moral clarity and conviction somehow imply a my way or the highway approach. However, does activism actually require and benefit from moral fundamentalism? In order to motivate actions that restructure conditions and redress wrongs, must people harden their hearts and minds against the clamor of contradictory theories, both speaking and acting as if they're governed by final truths? This idea that incorrigibility is a virtue of activism and advocacy makes some dubious assumptions about the public. To some intellectuals, the international resurgence of gaslighting demagogues and self-seeking cronyism is incontrovertible proof. I wrote that before the election. Is incontrovertible proof that we can ultimately expect very little of the public. On that view, the public switch is permanently set to dim, and it's up to intellectuals to take up the civilizing burden of enlightenment. White man's burden thing, right? Oh, that's really troubling territory. You want to go there? Maybe not a good idea. And that's the line of argument anyway. If this requires us to proclaim finalities, then so be it, we think. Disagreement about what we can reasonably expect of a democratic citizenry have a long history from Plato's Republic to the Federalist Papers. The clearest modern statement of alternatives was arguably the debate in the 1920s between American philosopher John Dewey and journalist Walter Lippmann. Dewey rejected what he took to be Lippmann's coziness with paternalistic rule by elite experts who oversimplify problems so that citizens will accept the reality that is bureaucratically packaged for them. Nothing made Dewey's democratic blood boil more than Lippmann's idea that intellectuals must lift the burden of inquiry from the provincial and parochial little heads of the masses while conferring the mandate of heaven on certain ideas. Does Lippmann's enlighten the masses outlook reveal intellectuals at their best? Does it reveal us at our best when we do the same thing, when we're in a pissy mood? I do it, right? But then, like, the question is philosophically, when you catch yourself, you just got to ask, all right, was that, like, intellectually defensible, right? If you spout off something, right? When you're saying how stupid, right? And I think it is, depending if you're saying that something was stupid and it was a decision and you can specify what was stupid about it, then that's intellectually quite respectable. Right. Basically, I think my parents were right to teach me not to call people stupid. But partly it's kind of like morally repugnant and right for the reason that no doubt they had in mind. But actually, it's philosophically really shallow. Right, because it assumed a sort of essentialism, right? That the reason that they did something stupid was that there's sort of this hidden inner essence of stupidity that is the causal source of their behaviors, right? And we call them stupid because just to identify that's bullshit, right? That's not going to take us anywhere. And so what we need is an analysis of stupidity that's a little bit more substantive. That's what I'm going to do here in just a minute. All right. So does Lippmann's enlighten the masses outlook reveal intellectuals at their best? People cling to the illusion of ironclad certainty, and Lippmann exploited that illusion. Dewey's alternative, in contrast, was to free public intelligence to creatively direct change. Accordingly, he focused throughout his life on the educative capacity of human experience. He argued that prophecies of public incompetence are self-fulfilling. We've expected too little of the public, and these low expectations continue to exact a heavy price. In the book, that's followed by a chapter, of course, on education. So, do theorists inadvertently legitimize moral fundamentalism? Moral philosophers routinely reject any fundamentalism, but in the next breath, they pretend to speak for the essence of morality and thereby freeze it into a completed object instead of an imaginative and collaborative project. This reinforces the one-way mentality. Building on his theory of operative intelligence, Dewey contended that no matter how carefully elaborated one's supreme moral principle, it will rarely focus one's attention on all of the relevant situational forces that one ought to note and deal with. His moral epistemology imbibed the spirit of James's pluralism. Quote, the word "and" trails after every sentence. Something always escapes, end quote. There's relevantly more to any situation than can be covered by a single principle, concept, or ideal, just as there's more to any person than what annoys us about them. Beware rational procedures that fail to fathom the extent to which we're inescapably limited and guided by our particular standpoints, contexts, and purposes. We're all frogs looking at the sky from the bottom of Chuang's well. We can compensate, but we can't escape. On Dewey's account of the terrain of moral action, predicaments are entanglements of often incompatible forces that pull us in multiple directions. I talk about Bruno Latour in the book in this context. This relative incommensurability of discordant situational factors presents a practical problem. A practical problem, not primarily a theoretical one, but a practical one. If factors are already in tension with each other, then monistic decision-making can lead to overly simplistic prescriptions that ignore or relegate relevant factors. This oversimplification is analogous to the logical fallacy of causal reductionism, assuming a single cause for a complex outcome and ignoring multiple conjoint variables. For example, rapid vaccination programs during the COVID-19 pandemic brought down hospitalization rates with some sacrifice in equity. Whereas a loss in aggregate welfare, at least in the short term, was seen in states and countries that rolled out restrictive yet more equitable processes that may have cost more lives. Healthcare ethics should be multidimensional because it must grapple with competing intractable factors, including overall social welfare, equity in the system, virtues such as social responsibility, issues of fairness, for example, relating to resource scarcity, duty, for example, do healthcare workers have a duty to treat? Priorities placed on positive and negative rights, right? Vaccine mandates. And the rights of workers and industries co-opted toward public causes. Not one of these concepts fully covers the rest, and there's no experiential basis for positing a unitary method or decision procedure that deals correctly with all of these issues of risk and vulnerability. Is the job of the theorist to discern which of these ways of organizing reflection should govern choice? Ethical monists have traditionally said yes. A pragmatic alternative is to challenge the assumption that a good theory suppresses variability. If we set up our approach as a response to particular conditions and consequences, it can gain practical leverage with complex problems without flattening variability among values or presuming that abstract theories can determine what we ought to do. In an unpublished and undated typescript associated with 3 independent factors in morals, Dewey wrote that, quote, genuine uncertainty is an essential trait of every moral situation, end quote. He wasn't merely remarking on the uncertainty that arises from the difficulty of a puzzle, like a Rubik's Cube or something, or to lack of access to relevant data to plug into our diagnostic machinery or algorithmic technology. He was content. I have a a long critique of Peter Singer and other utilitarians in the book in this context. Yeah. And correspondence with Singer, who kindly responded to that. And so I think it was quite clarificatory as well. Singer is typically misunderstood, and I think I have not misunderstood him. Right, and I was very careful about that, and I think he's wrong. Right, and that's much more powerful than getting the guy wrong, wrong like most people frankly do. And he was very kind and patient in responding to that. Dewey was contending that there simply is no exactly and irrecusably right mechanism, not even in principle, under ideal conditions, for definitively formulating and finally answering quandaries about which choice to make among viable alternatives. Moral complications tangle and diverge in unique ways, and we typically need time to think about them because they require us to artfully reconcile factors that are best understood through multiple concepts. My first book was John Dewey and Moral Imagination, which is kind of trying to set a model of how I think that can go forth well. Consequently, Dewey urged, quote, "It is not without significance," in this undated manuscript here, "it is not without significance that uncertainty is felt most keenly by those who are called conscientious," end quote. Under the restrictive assumption legitimized by traditional theorizing, monistic theorizing, unity is presumed to lie beneath conflict and diversity. A situation may seem to be a quagmire, the supposition runs, but rigorous examination or complete data to feed into our utility calculations, or Singer or others, right, or comparison to an ideally just world, Rawls, or perhaps comparison to an ideal egalitarian island of rational, albeit hapless contractors, Dworkin can continue. The book goes through a lot of other examples. The assumption is that these would reveal that A, there had been an objectively good, right, fair, or best path through the territory all along, and B, the path's goodness, rightness, or fairness overrides other considerations when it comes to justification, and that without those, we would be in ethical la-la land. Traditional monistic theories conserve the imagination required for wise deliberation. Competing perspectives may compensate for each other's concealments. But whatever we see with their help is situated within what is inconspicuous. Forgetting this, we'll pay for conceptual clarities by neglecting existential subject matter that troubled us to inquire in the first place. Okay. Conclusion here. Aren't we stuck with moral fundamentalism? Yes. Of course, we are. But its shape and extent are educable. Moral fundamentalism is at odds with the greatest educational need in any democracy. Drawing again from Dewey, that need is to improve, quote, "the methods and conditions of debate, discussion, and persuasion." That is the problem of the public. It sure is our problem. Moral fundamentalism is a vice because it obstructs communication, constricts deliberation about what's possible, and underwrites bad decisions. Social inquiry is more honest, collaborative, rigorous, and productive when youths learn to be patient with the suspense of reflection, open to discomfort and dissent, resolute yet distrustful of tunnel vision, aware of the fallibility and incompleteness of any decision or policy, practiced in listening, and imaginative in pursuing creative leads. We should teach students to value friction, and we should help them to become compassionate, active, and informed problem solvers. Instead of teaching them to oppose others' fundamentalism with more of the same, we need a more genuinely radical approach that is not Pollyanna-ish. We need democratic engagement and resistance without puritanical zealotry, courage in mediating troubles without certainty, bold action without fatalistic resignation or paralyzing guilt, and moral clarity without oversimplification. Okay, let's see, what time are we at? 11:30. All right, I'll spend a few minutes on the next section here. This is the bit about stupid decisions. And I'm just going to read here, page 52 of this new book called Beyond Moral Fundamentalism. I'm speaking totally tongue-in-cheek and grain of salt, barrel of salt, whatever. I'm going to attribute a pragmatic maxim to Dewey, who most certainly never had nor proposed a pragmatic maxim, but I think it's helpful to do that. And in a book, you can kind of contextualize and qualify enough to make it work, I hope. So I'm going to start with that. Had Dewey ever formulated a pragmatic maxim to clarify exactly what he thought made value inquiry more intelligent, which for him was one with specifying what makes it experimental, it might spotlight his emphasis on the ends-means continuum. As you can tell, I'm starting right in the middle of a chapter there. The ends-means continuum. Always state your ends in terms of the means you plan to use to achieve them. All right, there's my version of a pragmatic maxim. For example, if you are ultimately aiming for climate justice, equitable distribution of greenhouse gas emissions, the right to sustainable development, or the rights of future generations, then state these ends in terms of the means you propose for bringing them about. This chapter 2 is primarily focused on climate change and climate ethics. Dewey analyzed the feedback loop that has always implicitly connected what people intend to do, an aim, purpose, or end in view in Dewey's idiom, how they are going about it means, and what they have actually done, an end, consequence, fulfillment, consummation. These are inseparable despite the familiar gulf between intentions and consequences. As when the U.S. Soil Conservation Service vigorously incentivized kudzu in order to control erosion after the Dust Bowl of the 1930s. If you're not familiar with the American Southeast, this is quite a familiar sight. It worked. It worked pragmatically. Right? It worked. There were some unintended consequences of it, and it's costing us billions of dollars a year to deal with it. Dewey antedated what? Here to others. The story of Charles Lamb's dissertation on roast pig is the classic source here. Dewey talks about it in Theory of Valuation. I won't give the whole. We can go into. This is always fun. This is the one I do with students, though. Right? It's the town that they end up accidentally burning down a house, and like up in Vermont where I used to live, the houses and the barns were connected. So they accidentally burned down the house, and it killed a bunch of their pigs. And so picking through the rubble, one of them touches one of the pigs, and like anyone, it's very hot, right? He burns, right? He burns, and he puts him down, and he says, "Man, this is good." Right? Wow, Mom, this is great, right? Until hey, you guys, come on, you got to try this, right? Until they end up eating the barbecue, and so once it was all done, like they're out of barbecue, and so they got to burn down more houses, obviously, until they set for burning down houses, until there's no houses left, right? So Dewey loves this one, right? Where you've got the idea that the ends are self-justifying, right? Is what he wants to go after, and yet, right, as utterly and stupid, right, as that would be to do because of the price you have to pay by the means that you've chosen to bring about your end, he thinks we're being exactly that stupid in so much of our social and political behavior and ethical behavior, right? And he thinks that the analogy actually does hold, and I'm arguing he's spot on. right? We really are being that stupid. and again, the word stupid can mean many different things. I'm not a word czar telling you how to use the word stupid. I think that one of the meanings that we actually use in ordinary English, though, is this sense, right? That you do something well-intentioned, presumably, but there's always collateral damage, right? Literally, in war, collateral damage, which I will get to in a moment. All right. I love this one. This was you remember this was the Google AI, right? Someone said, "How can I keep the cheese on my pizza? You know, like when you're sticking in the oven, the cheese comes off, right, and it gets all over your oven. How can I?" Google AI, based on a Reddit comment that someone was making a fun joke, right? It's oh, you can glue it on. That's right. It's non-toxic glue. Right? It would work. Right? Okay, it would work. What else did you do? Right? When you did that. That's the question. All right. Dewey antedated what Columbia University sociologist Robert K. Merton influentially called the unanticipated consequences of purposive social action in a watershed article that cited Dewey. 1936, many people don't realize they were both at Columbia University. He was a colleague of Dewey's and cites Dewey in the article that became the law of unintended consequences in economics, right? So they're the direct Dewey causal connection there. Later social scientists contracted this to the law of unintended consequences, an insight that was pushed to its logical limit by Michael Scriven's goal-free evaluation model, as is well canvassed by moral philosophers debating the controverted principle of double effect. Side effects are often forecastable in light of past observations. I'll come back to that. In light of past observations, even when bad effects are not intended. So moral choices must somehow reckon with the unintended fallout. Dewey argued that due to that's mostly a sort of natural law theory, right? Which in the book, I end up criticizing, but I think in this it's actually some really insightful literature about and the principle of double effect. Dewey argued that due to the inevitability of unintended, yet practically relevant consequences, desirable or not, we must speak of the things we are consciously aiming for in terms of proposed actions and programs. In this way, Dewey urged, we can concretely specify actual spatio-temporal consequences of actions, direct and indirect. No matter how noble and brilliant our ideals and theories may be, they can never pin down the actual consequences. Such previsioning includes consequences for us as moral agents. For example, if our aim is to check the growth of aquatic weeds in Illinois without using nauseous herbicides, then we might consider a non-chemical biological control, which is just what Rachel Carson advocated in Silent Spring. Carson's solution was plausible at the level of abstract theory, but desirability in the abstract cannot determine how interventions will play out on the ground, so we need a reliably open-ended method for anticipating and tracking. Carson's proposal was the motivation behind the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's breeding of Asian carp in the 1960s to control aquatic weeds. Around here, you're probably familiar with them. Unfortunately, officials were so concerned to solve the problem under their nose that they failed to take the next step in any intelligent inquiry, which is to confer and pool experiences, drawing on the current state of experimental knowledge, so that ideally at an adequate scale, we note and track the relevant looping first and second order effects of those means. Instead of studying the problem as a many-headed hydra, fish and wildlife officials were preoccupied by the focal or first-order effects that suited their agenda. Soon, the carp became ecosystem conquerors, outcompeting other species. The consequence for U.S. waterways has been an ecological disaster, including a staggeringly costly ongoing effort by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers to prevent the carp from entering the Great Lakes up toward the Chicago area. I believe the last price tag was $5 billion a year for this. It worked. It controlled those aquatic weeds, man, did it. All right. Yeah. What else did you do when you did your working thing? Tracking secondary effects of our chosen means may also lead to serendipitous breakthrough achievements, as with Alexander Fleming's unexpected discovery of penicillin. Regardless of whether the end results of experiments satisfy our needs, desires, or purposes, a pragmatic method of inquiry reckons with them without presuming that results are somehow determined by theories or research programs. According to Dewey, such reckoning is what makes inquiry intelligent, i.e., experimental. The opposite approach is to assume that this end is what our theory or ideology has determined, so we can safely ignore extraneous results unrelated to satisfying our purposes. This is a moral fundamentalist maxim, reframed in terms of the ends-means continuum. It approaches problems from the wrong direction. Dewey's methodological concern for tracing varied consequences far enough can be framed negatively as a cautionary maxim following Mead. Beware anyone's ends which are asserted autocratically as finalities or absolutes, rather than in terms of the social means being proposed. And I'll conclude with this example here. For example, take security and justice as ends. Journalist Ronan Bergman's book, Rise and Kill First, shows that Israel's long-standing practice of targeted assassination, drone strikes, bombings, shootings, and poisonings, has resulted in many tactical successes that have dramatically worsened diplomatic relations. Yet, in Bergman's view, the collective aspirations for effective security among conflicting actors in the Middle East can only be achieved through diplomacy, not imposed through the method of force. His approach to conflicts in the region parallels what Isaiah Berlin called an uneasy equilibrium, which is constantly threatened and in constant need of repair, end quote. Bergman relates the tactics of Israel's Mossad security forces in an interview. Here's Bergman. They felt that at the tips of their fingers they could hit somebody way beyond enemy lines, deep in the enemy state, and solve the problem. It would work. And therefore, they do not need to turn to statesmanship or political reconciliation. And therefore, I think the story of the use of these special means is a series of extraordinary tactical successes, but at the same time, a disastrous political failure, end quote. When groups track only the isolated consequences that they consciously intended to bring about, such as eliminating an enemy, they do not usually feel responsible for collateral side effects of those means. The idea that the oppressed can do no wrong likewise presumes a holiday from moral responsibility. More generally, in the convective storm of terror and retribution, reactive fundamentalist habits prevail over patient experimental ones. So clashing sides double down on failed policies and tactics that inflict misery across generations. I got lots more in the book. I'm going to stop there at 11:45 and thank you, and I look forward to discussion.
Okay, we have plenty of time for questions. So, Harrison, why don't you get started?
Great talk. Really appreciated it.
Can I get to the next slide? Is there?
Oh, yeah.
No, thanks.
Okay.
Yeah, I got hockey players. I don't want the homeless.
Great talk. I really appreciated how relevant this is in contemporary discourse. My question is a question that I have a lot with ethical problems, which is the applicability. Mm-hmm. So I fully agree that it would be great if everyone was a pragmatic pluralist and focused on this kind of, or well, certainly over moral fundamentalism. But my question is if you're debating with somebody,
at least strategically, I would agree with you. I'm not sure if I want everyone to identify.
Well, maybe not. Yes. Yeah. But if you're in a debate with somebody who is a moral fundamentalist, obviously, I think we've seen that moral fundamentalism can be very rhetorically persuasive, and so there's a question of
it works real well. It works.
So the question is how can a pragmatic pluralism or pragmatic inquiry be more rhetorically persuasive when interacting with moral fundamentalists in a way not to be a zero-sum game, but there is a sense where people watching a debate always kind of talk about who won the debate or who
Of course.
persuades more people.
Yeah.
So do you think that it's innately persuasive enough as is, or is there more that it would need to be
Yeah,
done
I do think
bolster that?
I think that the other approach, radical as it would be, to not be a moral fundamentalist, actually it can be incredibly persuasive, and also quite refreshing. People just kind of don't know what it looks like because they're not used to seeing it.
Sure.
I think when you think about when anyone really thinks about the people that they often and genuinely admire the most, they don't tend to be the moral fundamentalists. And and I think of I'm actually going to give you an example that from just personal life. Most people on both sides of my family, they're not vegetarians, but they don't eat a lot of meat, and they just like have backed off, and it has become a little less important for them. Right. So I'm a vegetarian of sorts. Randy and I were corresponding, but right, I'm a pragmatic vegetarian. It's like really annoying, right? Because I'm like doggedly purist, about anything like that. But my default diet and my family's default diet is vegetarian, and that's kind of simple. They're the habits, right? Are kind of just vegetarian habits. And I do have ethical concerns about business as usual in the animal protein industry. So it's not just a matter of health, though. Hey, those are pretty good points. My father had a heart attack when I was 10. Uh, he made it 45 more years from the time that he was 45 because of changes of diet, and so that's always been a big reminder to me that so. So both sides of my family actually have some health reasons to do that. Uh, I think what happens with diet, which is a good example, and I use it throughout the book, in fact, is that you've got a lot of moral fundamentalism, right? Dietary ethics is just a circular firing squad, right? Everyone's just shooting at each other. And it can even be kind of humorous if you step back from it a little bit. And it's actually kind of refreshing to have folks who just aren't fundamentalists about it at all, but are willing to open up and just have conversations. And you just get used to them, and often other people's behaviors start changing. It wasn't because you were trying to change them, right? I didn't set out to try to make my family members alter their diet, right? I wasn't doing anything of the sort. I was living with them, and I'm a philosopher, and I like have conversations, and they ask questions, and I address questions candidly and openly, but I'm never doing this kind of number. But somehow people that I get to know well over long periods of time, you often end up with changes in behavior, and diet actually tends to be one of those. Like backing off on the meat, it's a little bit tends to be one of those things. And not because I'm doing it. I think that's one of those areas among many where it's really welcome to not approach things as a moral fundamentalist. But the default is that people seem to just go into it there. So, but again, that's just one example. Moral fundamentalism, however, my way or the highway works, but it works in exactly the way that I'm indicating here, like kudzu worked as an erosion control. Right. And that is what I am saying is that moral fundamentalism is stupid. Right. It is a way we make stupid decisions. And it is driving the country right now in a very bad direction.
So it kind of seems like people have this attitude of that they need to fight fire with fire, and you're basically proposing
Exactly
that we fight fire with water.
Yeah,
because we just
exactly.
calm things down, slow things down a little bit.
Fight the fire with water. Yeah, that's probably about right. Yeah, fighting fire with fire will not actually succeed.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Or controlled burn. There are.
I like that. Yeah.
It's a common fire tactic
Yeah.
in the Pacific Northwest to go to some of the more drier spots in the direction that the fire is heading and burn that off in a controlled way, so that way once the fire hits, it can't actually go past.
There's a dissertation in that. So, I mean, right. That's that sort of preemptive approach where you're actually trying to change the structural conditions of the burn itself.
Right. Especially
that's much more radical and revolutionary than fighting the fire with fire approach, right?
Well, it's also more pragmatic than the water, especially in a state like California, where it will take you multiple airlifts, assuming you have the water to begin with, to get to the burn. And by the time you have the multiple airlifts, it will have spread. from the original spot and have completely burned off regardless of the amount of embers. So
Say everything you just said at a metaphorical level, and you have a much more powerful image of social change, social action that is way more radical and revolutionary than typical moral fundamentalist responses to the moral fundamentalism that's happening, and I mean right now, right? And people are angry, and I understand that, right? But fighting it with moral fundamentalism, with more of the same, people will call themselves radical, right? But it's a pretty thin radicalism, right? The controlled burn approach, right, which again is structural, deep. That's a much better metaphor for what we need to do to deal with the fire.
Sure.
Yeah.
yeah, to tangent off a little bit, I do thank you for presenting one, but in two, I really do like where it's coming from. My concern is I think an aspect of moral fundamentalism that is being missed here is we cannot tell the difference between good faith and bad faith moral fundamentalism. I'm thinking in terms of a lot of political discourse when it comes to specifically fascism, but authoritarianism generally.
Yeah.
Because I believe a lot of people who are pro democracy or anti fascist in any capacity will find a lot of overlaps between fascism and moral fundamentalism in the sense of, in order for a lot of the bad acting that we see with moral fundamentalism comes from an overlap with a lot of fascist arguments of, if we keep engaging in kind, then we normalize these ideas.
Yeah.
Platforming these ideas normalizes them, but also we're normalizing bad behavior. So I'm just kind of wondering your thoughts on this and how a pragmatic pluralism is helpful in terms of pushing back against for the anti-fascist.
Yeah. I think the most important thing maybe to emphasize there, and regarding good faith and bad faith, that's an interesting direction to take it. But I may not be responding to that element of it, but I think there's a lot there to respond to. The response to situations where people have been wronged, redress is required more. Requires backbone, right? It requires courage. Sometimes it requires dogged resistance, and the sort of capitulating spinelessness that some universities, who could be named, like Columbia,
now they've uncapitulated.
have they uncapitulated?
Capitulated now.
So right, so
they won't be remembered as being spineless to begin with.
you know, no one in this room has ever heard me say something really nice about Harvard before, but I will go ahead and just leadership matters, right? Here, right? So, right. So you've got to have. Sometimes you got to resist, right?
Yeah.
But that the assumption among activists especially, or activators, is quite often that has to take the shape, the form of moral fundamentalism. That's where I'm saying no. That's just stupid, right? That's to take this form of a stupid approach, right? What you got to take is much more radical than that. But there's no implication, right, of spinelessness, right, or something that's wishy-washy. I think historically, Randy's done some work on this. Historically, pragmatism has very often been complicit and wishy-washy. You wrote a piece in the Pluralist a number of years ago. It was just spot on, right? There's no arguing with this. Historically, pragmatism has not necessarily done such a great job here. So the question now becomes: is that like endemic to pragmatism, or is it something that's a necessary part of it? You know, you can't extricate that, or can we take a basically pragmatic model and make it much more radical? And my suggestion is yes, you can. You've got to get beyond moral fundamentalism to do it. So I hope that answered. That's only a part of
Yeah,
a lot
I'm
of
happy
great
to-
insights in what you were asking about.
I'm happy to talk more about it further. I don't want to hog the
course,
Q&A,
yeah.
but that does help address it. Especially because that has been on my mind a lot.
Yeah.
Right. It's
Yeah.
really hard for it not to, given the once a week scheduled doom scroll. So.
Doug, yeah, please.
I have a couple of questions. A little bit with history, but also contemporary situation. The first is you've outlined very clearly why Dewey made education the primary philosophical question.
There is no hope without
But
that
then
as part of this picture.
The second part of it, which is the complexity of situations. In a situation where culture has not been educated to pluralistic, pragmatic discussions. So, and that takes me back to thinking about, I mean, Dewey's interest in Aristotle and virtue ethics as a background of what's happening. Aristotle clearly says you can't argue with an eggplant. And we read Plato throughout, especially in the Republic. The great difference between dialectical conversations and heuristic conversations are the ones you pointed out at the beginning. You're either there to win or you're there to find the truth, or find a better answer. Those need to be inculcated in the culture. So Thrasymachus obviously is the eggplant. You can't argue with Thrasymachus. It's not going to go anywhere. It's purely heuristic. So when you have a whole culture in a situation where there's a fairly wide set of Thrasymachus-like folks, that's going to skew your ability to have the kind of conversations that Dewey, I think, rightly thinks we need to have, which is another version of the question was just asked, but it's a more global thought about the whole situation.
Yeah.
Right? Whether it's the United States, whether it's a state, whether it's a city. Getting back to the primacy of character conditioning, education, to get people into this kind of argumentation, where you said at the end of the first one, we're struck with moral fundamentalism as a kind of practice. But it seems to me that Dewey would say that that's a feature of our failure to educate, and that we really need to start from the ground up once again, culturally, to get people in a position.
Is moral fundamentalism itself a feature of our failure to educate, so that the idea that we could actually get beyond it, or is it a feature of our humanity? But we're pouring gasoline on it, right?
Well,
right. So I'm tending to think that direction.
Beyond it.
Yeah.
But it seems to me that takes us back to a place where we're not currently at. We need to really rethink not just resistance to what's happening.
Yeah.
But to think of the new means to the end we're looking for in terms of a culture.
I just couldn't possibly agree more with you. The central chapter, literally the one in the very center, is called "Educating for Democracy," and the whole book falls apart. Well, unsurprisingly, given what you rightly just said, it falls completely apart without it, and I fall apart without it as well. Right? It would. That's where all the hope is, even if it's not. Maybe not, it's certainly not a utopian hope, right? But the question is just like, what direction can we push, right? The things will be better if we push this direction rather than that direction, right? The odds, we can improve the odds if we'll really dedicate ourselves to a different sort of education and raise the expectations, right? Instead of pandering to the masses, right? And lowering expectations. And that's one of the reasons I'm so critical of liberals like Lippmann, right? Who I think, because of their view of the public, their philosophy of the public, they basically amount to a sort of propagandizing approach to what ought to be education, and that's just shooting ourselves in the foot.
Yeah, it's kind of like the Straussian reading of
Exactly. Yes.
the same problem.
Yeah.
This change in education is the exact purpose of our new Casera Center. Everything you said. We're trying to educate truth speakers, and that's truth in the sense of telling the truth, right? And they have to be somewhat brave, et cetera, et cetera. It's every discipline together and looking at education in a new way. So, Yeah, I mean, I couldn't agree more. However, I, with regard to the moral absolutism that theorists tend to think underlies, and so we're talking about smart people, liberals even, right? Not Walter Lippmann necessarily, but our current woke
Yeah, yeah.
folks. When I encounter moral fundamentalism, I have found it extremely useful to use Rousseau in the following way. The general will is the supposition that there is an optimal course of action in any problem. It actually disagrees with what you're saying. The trouble is we don't know it, right? And why don't we know it? Rousseau's answer is self-interest, right? It's always self-interest that prevents us from discerning the general will. Now, as a pragmatist, I do not care whether the general will exists, whether there actually is an optimal course of action that would satisfy as best as possible, the solution.
Yeah.
What's important to me is that the person I'm talking to consider it. It's like, so if there were, right, an optimal course of action in any moral dilemma, what would it take to get closer to discerning it? I take that to be a kind of pragmatism, but it's closer to Royce or Peirce than it is to Dewey and James,
I
because it involves
think that's probably right.
as if supposition, and so as if we knew that there was a path. It gives people hope.
That's a deep and good question, Randy. And it's true that I don't I think much more like Dewey on this matter, because as soon as you think that uh, it's in principle possible, right, to have this the foundational value, uh, you're at least, even though we don't have it, we're going to
get
I'll try to approximate it, right? The thing is that we're going to frame the situation in terms of that, right? And so if there are multiple discordant values in a situation, we're going to tend to privilege one of them and we're going to hold it up. And so what the problem is that we're all seeing this guy from the bottom of the well, right? Right. And I think what can happen is that you can contract that well so you see less patch of sky, which is fine if that's the patch of sky that's most relevant to our consideration, right? That sort of simplification is really helpful so we're not overwhelmed. Kierkegaard writes about that. Too many possibilities, right? Right. So we do need to kind of restrict things. Sherlock Holmes talks about it as well. I've included in the book where you want to pare it down to the bare essentials, basically. But if your sense of what the bare essentials are is that it's about trying to find the mechanism for welfare calculation for senior, right? Right. Or it's going to be right about duty. It's going to be right some kind of rights orientation or what some sort of Dworkin type egalitarianism. You're going to be trying to at least approximate your sense of the foundational value, right, by framing everything that way, and then kind of. But I think what you need to be able to do is have a much more pluralistic
and that's
value
why it
system.
doesn't give people hope, is because it still feels messy. You'll remember John Stewart stood up and walked out while I was talking about the ineffectiveness of pragmatism in the civil rights era.
Yeah, no, I didn't remember that, but
Yeah, he did. He was so offended.
Yeah.
But you were there. But anyway, we were at Penn State. And so
Well, we were both presenting at that.
Yes.
Yeah, I was dissing Dewey on his animals. Right,
they
it's
weren't
just awful.
They weren't happy with
It's just, yeah.
but anyway, part of it is that religious fervor is something that pragmatism is allergic to, and that's what it sounds like to them if you frame. But here, what
I think people can learn to deal with the
your
message.
fear of the tactic is willing to. So we agree that the whatever ends we achieve, the means are imminent in them. Unfortunately, you can't really see that until the end has occurred, right? But you can guess that I'm choosing these means, and I'm trying not to taint my end by choosing it. But some of it has to do with strategy and some with tactics, that ends mean stuff.
Yeah.
And so I'm suggesting allowing, for two reasons, allowing people to believe that there is an optimal solution to any given moral problem in order to inspire hope, which I think leads to openness. And so it's a different tactic. And like I say, as a pragmatist, I don't care whether that optimal solution really exists, but I think I need it as a tactic in order to get people into this. But there's a second reason to do it as a pragmatist, and one is there exists no X such that is not a pragmatic argument. It's not, there's no empirical account that could justify the form of the argument. There exists no path such that it is optimal. You can't, as a pragmatist, rule this out. And so you shrug your shoulders and you say, well, it's possible. But then the next thing I say is, I don't really care, but only to people I trust. What I say, I don't really care if there actually is an optimal course of action here, but it is very important to some people to believe that it is. And so you allow it tactically in order to open them up with hope. People who have hope are just much easier to work with than our current situation.
Yeah.
I mean, so inspire hope, education, add those two things together. But I think you're just going to have to allow, because you say it, we're stuck with this.
Yeah, I think we are stuck with it, and hope is an essential element.
Yeah.
And you got to tell Santa Claus doesn't exist.
You
That's
do,
a serious problem.
you do, but I mean, that's down the line, right? If you could just get some progress in the meantime. I know
the book as a whole, both in the intro and in the culminating chapter, the theoretical chapter, which is centered on three independent factors and morals, is an exercise really in a sort of strategic or methodological pragmatism that you're advocating.
Actually, I call it tactical.
Tactical.
Yeah, because
I don't like
because I'm
tactical.
not willing to
Tactical
adopt
sounds
it as
too
a
much like those
strategy.
last two slides.
Yeah.
It's like,
But your worry would be that these means will end up tainting the ends, and I can't deny that that's a completely legitimate worry. On the other hand, if you can't get the conversation going without this tactic, then
so I think you're raising pragmatic concerns, and the experimental medium for that is our own lives together and our communication and collaboration together. And I'm perfectly apt to agree that the jury is out on that, and just how do we create a context for that sort of
you got
communication?
to try it.
So this is really important. So I think we would differ at least in emphases here. The final chapter, one thing that I really try to do, people always accusing me of being anti-Kantian for my whole career.
You're not anti-Kantian.
I'm actually quite Kantian in a way, in a way that I've kind of noticed, right? Especially practical imperative, those sort of things. And what I try to do in the last chapter is to be really sensitive and sympathetic, both to utilitarianism, as I mentioned earlier, but also to Kant. And I try to develop what would like a pragmatic, pluralistic, admittedly appropriation of Kant, right? Kant's not going to go. There, and I make it really clear why he's not going to go there.
Johnson, I mean, he
Well,
makes,
and I'm
makes
not. He
contact.
is a neo-Kantian. I am not a neo-Kantian.
Yeah.
Right? But I'm trying to be really sympathetic to that factor in moral life, right? The factor of beauty. And so what I try to do is present what would a Kantian, a sort of could we have a pragmatic pluralist Kantianism that is not replaced by my idiom and my emphases, but is still working within that tradition, right? That long-lived tradition that has contributed so much. Thank you, John Rawls, and we should say, right, and many others, right, to our insights, our moral insights. What would the continuation of that look like, right, if it got beyond moral fundamentalism, right, and moved toward a pluralistic orientation? Does that mean the end of Kantianism? Does it mean the end of utilitarianism? Right? Does it mean the end of virtue theory? All of the just because they've gotten beyond the monism? And my argument is that it doesn't mean anything of the sort, right? That you could actually what you would have is a much more powerful development, 21st century development of all those traditions. And moreover, I think, and I give citations, that that's where things are going. I'm not a prophet, and my crystal ball absolutely doesn't work, but I'm seeing tendencies right in those directions in virtue theory and among Kantians and among utilitarians and contract theorists and others moving in a direction that's actually more compatible with some of the things that I'm indicating. I just want to encourage them along the way. But for the most part, I do that in a way that's a sort of strategic, you can call it tactical, pragmatic view. And I most certainly want to avoid any sort of insistence that people speak my idiom, right, or have the same dominant emphases in their moral philosophy as I do, right? That's what I want to avoid as much as possible, please.
Yeah, I want to hop on and point out what was unsaid about hope is the fact that, yes, having that feeling is important and necessary, but with what you have to say on your point about the secondary consequences of the action, yeah, doing that course of action does give hope, but a lot of people tend to ignore the fact that hope is also messy, just like a pragmatist commitment to and a critique of it, a non-answer is messy,
Yeah,
to put it a little bluntly. But
that's a good response to the messiness concern. Yeah, I
yeah,
appreciate
because like
that point.
hope, it being that we're innately complex creatures and hope being a feeling and feeling being innately complex and messy will result in messy consequences. Absolutely, innately. And the it makes me think of specifically Urinetown the musical, which is conveniently also opens tonight and closes Saturday. The satire where the whole premise of the musical is we're in a dystopian society where there's not enough water and people have to pay to pee. That's the whole concept of the whole concept. Spoiler, everyone dies at the end. But like the reason I bring this up is because a theme that I saw in that play philosophically when it comes to talking about hope, especially when we get into what could be a potential utopian interpretation from your framework, is, and I think that your framework, given your presentation, helps to caution against, is you can't give hope without some guidelines. You can't give hope without some action plans. And my concern is with the critique you brought up, is that we get too far into the realm of ideals that we lose grounding of what the potential future consequences that create the next dystopian problem.
Well, the discernment of the general will is the next step,
Mhm.
and that's going to require dialogue and education. And in other words, I don't think it's going to end up in utopianism at all,
I mean,
because the discernment of the general will is impossible.
I think utopian sentiment important. There's hope in there, but I see with kind of the
I don't take this to be a utopian solution.
what I'm trying to say is like the overlap is a cautioning of like the religious zeal
Mhm.
critique that you brought up. It's just messy. It will always be messy.
Supposed to be nice.
Do you want to respond to that?
I butted in and interrupted her while she was speaking and responded. These are the idea of messiness, which Randy brought up, um, seem and its relation to hope, which you're conjoining here, I think ends up being highly appropriate. That I was mentioned earlier when I interrupted you, and that people can deal with messiness. And like I'm thinking about my students, like have a lot of nursing students. It's one of our biggest programs, and our the biggest minor at Radford University, ethics, which means we're sitting pretty in our department. Right, enrollment is not a problem for us. We're always over 100%, right, and so we can't offer enough courses, and so this is good. Not enough majors. That's a different area to try to work out. But especially I'm thinking the nursing students, whenever we're talking about issues, you can just see how much they appreciate that someone is not saying, look, there's the straight and narrow path and there's a spotlight shining upon it and you need to go for it and be ethical, right? But someone is saying, man, we're just pulling our hair out. You got all these possibilities are incompatible with each other, right? And the goods and duties are colliding, and the kind of people that we want to be seems to be incompatible with the rules that we have to follow to do that. And right, when we're just in this mess, right? And every day they feel that. And to have someone in class and reading text associated with it to just acknowledge how messy it is. It's just such a welcome. I just see them so relieved that someone's acknowledging this and isn't trying to pretend that everything is pat, right, and neat. And I think that provides them with some hope as well. So I like, and I don't think you would disagree either, that hope can be messy.
True. So this might end up being a version of Doug's question, but I'm wondering about what do we do about false consciousness, right? So I often think that a voice we need to introduce into the Dewey-Lippmann debate is Herbert Marcuse, who is sophisticated in a way that I think neither Lippmann nor Dewey is, about the ways in which powerful social forces condition us, like in our own repression, to adopt beliefs and desires that, when we act on them, end up sort of reinforcing our own oppression. And that those beliefs and desires are very, if not, I mean, they're not completely incorrigible, but they're very hard to shake.
Adams was more onto that.
And and then so the position we get out of Marcuse is neither the technocratic elites nor the public as it exists, or as we can imagine, sort of small social changes getting us to. I don't know that he has a positive account at all, but then I think the negation of both of those views is powerful, right? And I don't know that it goes to your question about the intellectuals, like what do we do? Do we just call everybody stupid? I mean, I think there is reason to doubt that we can just turn to the people and say, what do you want? Let's work it out, right? That come from that kind of critical traditions. I don't know if you have thoughts about what to do with that set of problems. Is it just education? Is education going to solve it? I don't know.
Well, isn't Marcuse a controlled burn kind of guy?
That's it.
Yeah.
Go back to that.
He's negative about that, but he says that, I mean, the one place, the one-dimensional man, it's the arts.
Yeah.
Most fundamental in terms, we don't call that education, but that was the one place of redemption he thought was a possibility of getting out. And if we would, I don't want to cheat on Dewey here, but if we made him a better esthetician, I like art as experience, but if that were built into democracy as education more significantly, I think that might aim in the direction you're looking at. Because of otherwise Marcuse thinks we're pretty damn hopeless.
I like that. When on my East Asian steeped, lived in Japan steeped view, artist experience is like experience in nature is an entirely post-China book where he also had a few years to really think about that. Right? And he could not possibly have written it without living in East Asia for a couple of years, right? It really helped to reorient him. Democracy and Education, very much a pre-China book, as is Reconstruction and Philosophy, which I think came out while he was over there. But nonetheless, it's very, and there's a thinness to both of them. But when you put like artist experience together with Democracy and Education, you kind of weave them together, which I tried to do right here. You get a much more powerful view, and it may be that a sort of robust Deweyan aesthetic education. It may be some response to that, but I don't think Dewey is a really great philosopher when it comes to power in general. Again, Adams was onto it much more than he was, any more than he was a good philosopher of the Black experience, right? It's just he's not, right? You better turn to some other muse, Baldwin or whatever you want to kind of engage with that. He's not going to give a lot of insights there. So I think it's right to turn to Marcuse and others who have really highlighted that right? And then see what are some of the intellectual resources that Dewey offers to enter into that conversation. But Dewey himself is going to put the problem in inadequately. Same thing with animal ethics and possibly a whole lot of other issues. And I think that's the best way to engage him. The most important thing is just to recognize that he belongs in the debate, right? And also, if you criticize Dewey, you've probably done something really good. If you've done it by understanding him rather than misunderstanding him, the other side of that criticism, whatever you just did, is probably going to be some really good philosophy. There's going to be a lot of insights there because he's not that easy to criticize. Right. But a lot of people have very successfully done it and generate a lot of good insights. So I appreciate that. Dewey is not a philosopher of power. And also, I say that at the start of the new book, that is not that I'm not taking the position in there that moral and political life is primarily about spheres of power colliding, right? And so that more Foucaultian type view is not the orientation of the book, but I'm also not denying it, right? And in multiple places in the book, I try to include that as well, but I do not regard Dewey as an adequate philosopher of power, and I think a lot of work remains to be done in that direction today.
All right. Please join me in thanking Steve Fesmire.